We're so happy to welcome you today. You're so incredibly accomplished. You're an author, you're a journalist with over 10 books published, and you have 11 commissioned screenplays. Your accomplishments are numerous, and they include being a writer on NBC's Law and Order. And we're just so happy to have you with us today.
Thank you so much. That's really impressive. Go ahead.
So I had to ask, did you always envision yourself, since when you started reading, as a writer and someone who would do what you were reading as a kid?
Well, yeah, when I was a kid, I used to write what they called dentist stories. I was a young kid growing up in a tenement in Brooklyn, and they were pretty simple. They would consist of 3 acts, though. There would be the sheriff rode into town, the sheriff shot all the bad guys, the sheriff rode out of town. It was that kind of a thing. And I was a comic book freak. I read a lot of comic books. I had a mother who really emphasized that reading. We grew up kind of poor, so very poor. They were immigrants from Ireland, and my dad had a wooden leg. He lost his leg in a soccer accident playing over here. So he raised 7 kids with one leg, and my mom worked as a cashier in a movie house, and there were 7 of us, so there wasn't a lot of money. But the one thing that was affordable, that was probably a gift that is priceless, was a library card. My mom thought that the road out of poverty was through the Brooklyn Public Library, and she worked down the block as a cashier at a movie theater. So we got all the books we wanted for free, and we saw all the movies we wanted for free.
So cool.
And 3 of us have written books, and 4 of us have worked in the movie business. And I think there's no accident there that my mom had a huge effect on it, especially on my older brother, Pete, who was the oldest of the 7. He was 16 years older than me, just passed away last year. But he was the first one to become a writer. And I had a big brother who was a writer. Now, if my big brother had been a fireman or a police officer, I'd probably be a fireman or a cop now, But I had a big brother who was a writer, and he demystified the whole concept for me, because he would sometimes take us with him on stories, and we would see him asking questions, writing them down in his notebook, and then come home and watching him pound it out on what's an old-fashioned typewriter in those days.
Wow.
A manual typewriter. It wasn't even an electric. It was a manual, which is like science fiction for you. But anyway, and then the next day I would see his story with his photograph on the column in New York Post, and I would see people on all the subways reading his, and it was like kind of magical, And so I kind of emulated him, and I would write stories. And Pete had a lot of benefits of his job. You could get tickets to go to ball games or the circus, but he would only give them to us, to me and my other brothers, if we promised to write about it. We'd have to write a composition about it. And he would make it a contest, and it always became a 4-way tie, and every one of us would get $1. But it gave us the incentive to look at things, and not just see, but to look, and not to hear, but to listen, and to pay attention to how many clowns were there, what colors were they wearing, and what were the acts, describe the acts and use verbs and nouns to do that. And so it made you use language that you were learning in school, and it made it more vivid. And then he would correct it and tell you how to make it better. He was an amazing big brother. So then later on, I'm sorry this is such a long answer, but
it's beautiful.
Later on, when he became a very popular columnist for the New York Post, and also a screenwriter and a novelist, he would travel a lot. And when he was away on assignment, before there was an internet or a fax machine or anything like that, the only way when you see old movies, you'll see them, get me rewrite, you would phone it in. He didn't trust the rewrite desk. He would phone it in to me, and because I was living in his house, and I would sit there and type out his column. And so feeling the keys under my fingers and listening to the language that he chose to use, the words, the concrete nouns and the active verbs that really gave you a sense of you are there at the scene of this story, and watching how each paragraph was like a brick in a building, and that the quotes in between were like the mortar that held the bricks together, and those were the quotes from the people who were talking to him. And then he would describe the weather and what people were wearing and what the issue was. And then later on, deeper into the column, he would express his opinion. And he would get he always thought that you needed to earn your opinion. Everybody has an opinion, but if you want to have an opinion that goes into the mass media, you really should do a little bit of work and go take a look and listen to the people on a local level who are going to be affected by this story. So Pete would go and show up. And I learned how to type and how to write and how to build a story. You build a story with its bricklaying, and then a lot of times the end of the story, what they call the kicker, is in the lead. You try to echo what you started the story out as in the end. Not always, but maybe 75% of the time you get lucky enough to do that. That led me on a path from when I was in high school. Probably, I mean, when I was a younger kid, I wrote those dentist stories, but Pete recognized that I wanted to be a writer. And those stories about clowns and baseball players and double plays and basketball games and boxing matches and whatever he got us tickets for, we had to earn them. The way we had to earn our opinion, we had to earn the freebies. There was nothing free in life. He made us learn from it. And the only gifts he ever gave us, we were always looking for new cap pistols or, robots or, Pete would only give us books. Wow. Books. That's all we ever got from Pete was books. And they gave me a life. That's the foundation we came from. And we all came out of this little tenement in Brooklyn where, when you were reading the books from the library, you could be one of the Arabian Nights, or you could be an astronaut in outer space, or you could go back in time and be a biblical figure, or you could be in science fiction, whatever grabs your fancy. But reading was everything, and I still think that today. And I've been a teacher, I taught in college level, and I encouraged all my students that read everything. Don't just read nonfiction, read fiction too. It's really
at the college level. What type of courses do you teach? Is it journalism, or do you?
Yeah, I taught introduction to journalism and then advanced journalism at Brooklyn College, and then at their graduate film school graduate school down at the Brooklyn Navy Yard, I taught screenwriting.
Oh, okay, interesting.
Yeah, so I taught at two different levels, at undergrad and grad level.
Did you have a favorite genre in those years where you were writing as a little kid and going to the library?
Always, and still do love mystery and thrillers.
Really?
I started with, the Hardy Boys, and I love a mystery, something that makes you turn the page. You want to find something out. A story. The great thing about story is, and then, and what's next, and that's what keeps you up late at night. We used to read under the covers with a flashlight. You wanted to know. And so to this day, I still like mysteries and thrillers, and I write for a show that's, a police mystery, it's a detective series. So it's a perfect fit for me. And I wrote a series of books about a private detective, but and a couple of them about reporters investigating crimes and different things. That's what captured my fancy from a young age.
Dennis, did you ever think about becoming a lawyer or a detective?
No.
Never?
No. From when I was in high school, I never wanted to be anything else but a writer.
Fascinating.
That's all I ever wanted to be, was a writer. I thought that I might someday teach, but you know, and when I thought I had enough to pass on, I never took education courses in school, but you know, I wrote a newspaper column for 45 years, and so in 3 different cities. And so I thought I knew enough about it that I could tell people a few things. Cool. I could leave them with more than they knew when they started. And that's and I approached it and told them that I wasn't like your average teacher that was going to teach you out of a textbook, or you know, and go by what they call a syllabus, which is a course. You know, it describes what the course is. I was going to do it my way and give you practical advice about how to do an interview. You know, what kind of shoes to wear, how to get ahead in the newsroom, how to excel from, you know, a young reporter to a columnist. How do you earn that? And it's all about work ethic. And you can't, the things that I couldn't teach were passion. You can't teach passion. You either have it or you don't. You must have it because you're so young that you're doing this from an early age. It means you really want to do this. It's inside of you, and that no one can teach you that. The other thing you can't teach anybody is imagination, you know, and that's your own. I mean, in that famous movie Miracle on 34th Street, somebody says the greatest nation in the world is the imagination, and I always loved that line. And it is, because that's what makes you unique, and you can be imaginative about nonfiction, about journalism. You can think outside of the box. There's a famous columnist named Jimmy Breslin. When everybody was covering when John F. Kennedy was assassinated, everybody ran to go and interview the Kennedy family and the other dignitaries, the other politicians, the other world leaders, or Jackie Onassis. Jimmy Breslin went to the graveyard and interviewed the man who dug his grave. That was an amazing. The guy who made $3.07 an hour, who dug John F. Kennedy's grave, was a black guy who lived through the civil rights movement at that time it was taking place, who loved Kennedy, and his place in history was he was the man who dug his beloved president's grave. That is using your imagination. So I taught, and it stands out as a classic. You have to read it. If you Google Jimmy Breslin and the Gravedigger, you'll get to find that story. Read it. And then in any story that you're doing, any big story, find the Gravedigger. Find somebody that no one else is thinking about. And that will make you unique. You'll find a new way into it. Find the last guy that, you know, bought flowers for you know, some famous celebrity, or somebody who served him his last drink. When Joan Rivers died, she did her last act in a bar and restaurant on 42nd Street called
Right by it.
You know, go talk to the guy who owns it, the saloon owner, and you know, he'll tell you all about Joan Rivers off stage and on, and you'll get a real portrait of her. You know, so think about the Gravedigger in always in every story. Try to think. What Breslin did so brilliantly was he thought outside of the box, and he did not run with the herd. He was a lone stallion that went and saw things a unique way. That'll make you separate you from everybody else and give you a head start in this business.
Dennis, I just watched that special on HBO.
Yeah,
so good. Oh my goodness! And one of my favorite scenes is your brother when he's older and his typewriter and how he put big letters.
Yeah,
I was like, that was one of the most beautiful things.
Yeah, and he kept writing to the very end. Yeah.
And was your brother one of the guys that pulled the gun out of the hand?
Yeah.
Tell Kai that.
Huh?
Kai doesn't know that story, I don't think.
Yeah, when John F. Kennedy's brother, Robert Kennedy, was running for president, I was living with my brother Pete at the time, earlier that year in Dublin, Ireland. And we had a brother in Vietnam. And it was a terrible, terrible war that I was against, that even my brother that was there was against, but he was a medic in an airborne unit, saw a lot of action. And we were so upset, and Pete was so upset that he wrote to Robert Kennedy, who was fiercely against the war, one of the few guys that had the courage to say that the war was wrong, even though his own brother had been one of the people that first sent troops there. And he said, Bobby, he sent him this long, passionate letter telling him why he should run. And a couple of days later, a telegram came to our door in Dublin, in Ireland, and said, I'm taking your advice. Please come home. I need you. And so Pete went home and worked on Kennedy's campaign. And so he was with him when, I think it was June 10th, 1968, in the Ambassador Hotel, in the pantry of the Ambassador Hotel, when a crazy guy who stepped out of the crowd after he had just won the California primary and aimed a pistol and shot him like his brother had been shot. And my brother Pete was one of the guys that wrestled the gun out of his hand and tackled him. And Jimmy Breslin was there too.
Was he? Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Wow, that's unbelievable.
Breslin was there in the room. The two of them, were always good friends. And although everybody thought they were competitors, they really weren't. They were like buddies. And they were quite different in the way they approached their jobs. Right. Both of them brilliant, and they're quite different, Yeah. They were Irish and they were, Burroughs guys. And so people associated that. But Pete always, followed a different drum than Jimmy. It just not one was better than the other. They were different.
Yeah.
That was an amazing circumstance for a guy and yet he thought it was the biggest mistake of his journalism career.
Why?
That he had become too close to a politician. You're not supposed to get too close to the people that you write about. It's okay to be kind of friendly, but don't be a friend, because it sort of blinds you to their faults. Mm-hmm. and it takes away your objectivity. You shouldn't have a conflict, what's called a conflict of interest. It's very important, Kai, that you don't get too close to the people you write about. And it was one of his big regrets, although he loved Kennedy and believed in him because he wanted the war to end. But looking back at his career, that was one of his regrets.
I understand what you're saying. No matter what, that was an incredibly heroic action on his part to wrestle the gun out of the assassin's hand. Incredibly heroic.
Well, he wasn't the only one. There were a bunch of people that did, including a big, huge football player named Roosevelt Greer, who was named for Franklin Roosevelt, but Delano Roosevelt, a famous president. But I think that Pete was the kind of guy, if he had been there when somebody shot Ronald Reagan, who he didn't agree with, he would have done the same. It was just an insane act and not something that you could condone, but it happened to be that he was shooting a friend of his, and that his first instinct was. And Pete grew up a rough, tough kind of guy in the Brooklyn street. When he was in the Navy, he boxed, and his best friend was a light heavyweight champion of the world, Jose Torres, and so Pete had a sort of real, what you would call a macho side when he was younger, which he refined later on. And we all try to have to lose that. But when you're growing up in Brooklyn, you kind of didn't have a choice. In the old Brooklyn, it was a really tough place to grow up. So if you got picked on if you didn't roll around the gutters with bullies. But anyway.
I've talked to a writer before who had the most specific process for writing. She said that she would just shut herself in a room for 6 months and only break for eating and sleeping and would just write. Do you have a very specific writing process?
Everybody has a different one, but I write every day. And when I'm writing for a TV show now, so we have to meet. There's a team effort that's involved, although you go off and write the script on your own. But we have a writer's room that we meet with on Zoom these days because of COVID. But usually we sit around a big table and pitch ideas, and then you have one-on-ones with the showrunner. That's screenwriting. Screenwriting is very much a collaborative effort. And even when it's just you and a screenplay, you, at least with the director, the studio head, you with the lead actor, you with the producer, you with different people, because it takes so many people to make a movie. It takes, you ever see the credits at the end of a film? Every one of them has to be there. I mean, they all have a function, and you don't have to meet as the writer with every one of them, but you do have to meet with, at least a half a dozen or a dozen sometimes in the beginning. When I'm writing a novel, I have a simple process. I go to bed early you know, about 11 o'clock, I get up at 6 and I write in the mornings. I like to, as much as possible, I like to get up with hear the birds singing when I'm starting to write. And then I write at least 4 or 5 hours. And when you're feeling tired, I usually stop, because you wind up having to rewrite it all the next day. If you you know, it shows in the work when you're tired. So if you get 4 or 5 good hours every day, you're going to have a book done in a year. I mean, within a year. And it's a process that I love, but it's solitary. But I never feel alone, because if you're writing fiction, you're not alone. All those characters that you're giving voice to are in the room with you. And sometimes a magical thing happens. They start writing the book. They take over and they tell you what they want to do. And then sometimes you have to go back and rewrite and tone them down a little bit. But you have, if you're letting it rip, you have to trust yourself. That's one of the first things a writer has to do, is trust him or herself to know where you kind of know where it's going. I don't follow a strict outline anymore. In my first 2 novels I did, because I was learning the process. But after that, if I kind of know what the book's about, I want to be surprised like the reader. Okay. And I find that it's much better if you're surprised, and you definitely think the reader's going to, you say, oh my God, maybe she did it. You know, and it occurs to you halfway through. And if you turn, then I think the reader will enjoy that twist and turn themselves. Otherwise, you lose interest and it becomes mechanical, and you're sort of painting by numbers. So,
are you working on a book now?
I have one half finished, but I've been so busy on the TV show that I haven't gotten back to it in a while. And it's with the COVID, it's been all encompassing. You know, in an episode of we have 16 episodes this year. Usually we have 22, 24. Wow. But I've had my finger in at least 5 of them, so it's been constant. And I'm not complaining. I mean, and we've been renewed for 3 seasons, so we'll be working out. But during my hiatus, I probably get back to it. Yeah.
Okay. Have you ever experienced writer's block or no?
No.
Wow.
I don't know what it is. Huh. Because when you work for a nursepaper, you're not allowed to have that, or else you get fired, right? And if you have kids, you can't have writer's block either, because you gotta do things like feed them, and clothe them, and pay the rent. So I have kids, and so I always had. I don't anymore, but I used to. For the bulk of my career, I had a newspaper column to write 3 times a week. You had to write 3 columns a week, so there was no way not to. And when you're going out with a notepad and you're covering a story and you're involved in other people's lives, how could you get blocked? You're covering a murder, you're covering a campaign, a trial. There's tons to write about. You're writing it down. Well, and then on the way back to home to write it, you're kind of digesting and letting all this material you just witnessed marinate in your brain pan, and the lead come. If you get the first sentence, the rest of it goes. As soon as you get your lead, and sometimes the lead is really in the 3rd graph, but you won't know till you get there. But usually the first sentence dictates what the rest of it's going to be. So I never experienced writer's block, and I guess I'm one of those few writers who actually likes the process. I like to write. A lot of writers hate it.
Really?
I love traveling, but I hate the process of traveling. I like getting there. Yeah. I don't like going to the airport and going through but I like waking up in the morning and realize, wait, I'm in Dublin, I'm in Rome. I like that, but I don't like the process. I actually like the process. I find it fascinating, writing this first draft and feeling it come out of you. It's a cathartic. It's a feeling that it gives me great pleasure to create something. And then when the day is done, you have a great feeling that it's not been wasted. The words that have passed through your brain are there forever. That's what I kind of like about it.
Were you ever covering a story about crime or mafia, and did you ever feel threatened while you were writing it, or worried about ramifications?
The one time that I felt threatened, in 1977, there was a massive blackout in New York, and myself and another writer named Michael Daly, I had on a white suit because there was a famous movie out then called Saturday Night Fever, and people were wearing white suits, and it was the middle of the summer, and I wound up in a neighborhood called Bushwick, which was in those days a real tough inner city ghetto, and today it's a very hip kind of hipster place, but and it was filled with poverty and people living in squalor and tough gangs, and there was no light, there was no electric, and there was massive looting on a street called Broadway in Brooklyn. And there was an elevated subway track overhead, so there wasn't even any moonlight because the track sort of blocked all the light, and it was pitch black. And the two of us were wearing our press cards, and we got surrounded by a gang as people were looting and everything. We were interviewing, and they accused us of being cops because the press card is issued by the police department, and it said New York City Police Department on it. And it just so happened, they were ready to do us some harm for sure. And one guy pushed everybody out of the way, a gang guy with a headband and a vest. And he said, "Hold on, he's cool." And he pointed to Michael Daly. Michael Daly had just done a cover story on him because he was the head of a gang from Coney Island called the Crazy Homicides, and the guy's nickname was Outlaw. And he said, "Nah, they're cool. They're cool. If you could read, bro, that says it was issued by the police." And he was yelling at all the other guys. But, and so they left us alone after that. That was the one time that I felt really endangered. Other than that, no, because when I grew up in a tough part of Brooklyn. We lived in a housing project, my family, for a couple of years. And, so I knew how to handle myself in the street, and I didn't have a lot of fear. I've never had any fear about going anywhere to cover anything.
Dennis, I got a question. What about when you would interview people, could you ever sense that someone was lying? And was there any kind of signs that you would be like, yeah, I don't think this.
Yeah, mostly politicians.
Okay.
But the average person in the street very rarely will feed you a line of bull because especially in the old days when they couldn't wait to talk. Nobody ever went to the kind of people I was interested in covering, which was the inner city and the forgotten people, or I called the people in the blue seats. It was my job to give the common New Yorker a voice. They couldn't wait to talk, but you would check out what they to make sure that they were legit. Sometimes they would show you a driver's license, or if they were making wild accusations about somebody, then you would have to, check it out. But I got hoodwinked once or twice, maybe in my time, but but for the most part, no. Politicians will lie to you every day of the week, and and cops, cops, don't always tell you the truth either. So you got to, and any official spokesperson that you speak to, take it with a grain of salt, because it's all going to be spin. But the average common person in the street is usually telling you what they feel in their gut, and they can't wait to talk because nobody ever talks to them. Now, today, with social media and with cameras and videos, people have a bigger voice. Then in the old days, they did not, so you're lucky that, when I was 13, I couldn't have launched my own website. There was no such thing as a website. So there's a lot of citizen journalists now that didn't exist then. But to become a professional news person, you need other people around you that are going to check what you're doing to make sure that people will believe it and take it seriously, So professionalized news will always exist because people want to know that can I believe this or not, So that's why, there's always going to be room for young people like you to break into the business. But it depends, it's not, newspapers are almost dead, but there's all these other websites that didn't exist before. There's Gothamist, there's City, there's Gawker, there's a Brooklyner, there's all kinds of other stuff. as long as you go to a place that has an editor that's responsible, that has a legal department that vets it, you know, to make sure that it's responsible, then people will believe it. Although I think in the last 4 years, the business has taken a huge hit because people don't believe facts anymore. It's odd. We've gone through a terrible time in the press because we had a president who called us the enemy of the people, and which we are not. We are the friend of the people. We are the people. We are the people. If it wasn't for the press, I think he might still be in office. I think the press got the truth out somehow, to at least to most of the people.
Do you have a particular piece that you have done in your entire career that you consider your masterpiece?
Well, probably not, because you know, I've done probably, I try to estimate at one time probably 4,000 columns, and you know, and pieces of journalism. But the ones that I'm really proud of would be the ones about major events. I think my columns on the Sandy Hook Newtown shootings at Christmas was some of my most powerful ones because they affected me so much. I don't care how jaded you are or how callous you are. Some reporters become like cops. You know, you got to try to leave the story in the newsroom and not take it home because you don't want it to infect your personal life. I couldn't do that with Sandy Hook because when you saw the size of the coffins, they were as smaller than their toy chests. That you lived with that forever, especially if you had kids. And if you interviewed the parents like I did of some of the kids that were killed, those moments stay with you forever. And a lot of the reporters were staying in motels and stuff nearby. I drove home every night because I refused to stay in the town. It was too sad. I couldn't wait to get home and hug my kid and watch a ball game, or you know, and try to shake it off and then drive back up in the morning. But I covered it every day for 2 weeks. And I usually revisit it every year. I write about it on the anniversary. Although I'm not writing steadily for a newspaper anymore. I still do occasional columns for the Daily News or Daily Beast, or, you know, I have outlets I can write for, but I don't do as much journalism as I did. I think that it's time for young people to do it. I've done enough of it, you know. But I think those were really powerful, and ones that I'm glad I did. And I think the stuff on Hurricane Sandy was pretty strong. And then just the whole series of columns I did through the crack epidemic in New York back in the 80s was really some really good street reporting. I went into neighborhoods that a lot of people didn't go to and spoke to some of these gang bangers with the machine guns and the coke dealers and the crack dealers, and try to get my hands around it, you know, and try to understand what was happening to the city, because we were up to a point where we had 2,200 murders in 1 year. 2,200 murders in one single year. And it was all triggered by crack cocaine. And so that was an epidemic that really scourged our city. So I think my reporting on all that stuff was pretty good. I'd hold it up against anybody else's, I think.
Cool. Did you have a particular person that you met and had to interview as a reporter that was your favorite to interview?
Wow. I had some of the people that I interviewed, you know, that were like famous would be, I mean, one of my favorites was Tom Hanks, because he was so, you know, he was shooting a movie called You've Got Mail, and he was in a trailer on a movie set, and when I knocked on the door, he answered the door, not a publicist, And he was eating Chinese out of a box, and he sat down. He said, "You want some Chinese?" And we two of us ate Chinese food together. And he talked about his whole career and how he used to live right there on that street in a roach and mouse infested apartment when he was a struggling actor, and he used to wait tables and get fired all the time because he was a terrible waiter. and he had a big series coming out on HBO called From the Earth to the Moon about the astronauts who went to the moon, and he just, there was no level of PR people in between, and he just spoke for an hour the way you're speaking to me. And I just ran it as a Q&A. I couldn't approve on it, and I really like him, and we stay in touch. I just thought he was a really genuine guy who gave the best piece of advice, because he was in a TV series. I asked him what his advice to young actors were, and he said, my one biggest piece of advice is be prepared for luck. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, I thought I had made it after struggling as a waiter when I got a TV series called Buzzin' Buddies. And he said, and I thought I was big as the cat's meow, and I thought I was the bee's knees, and I thought I would work forever. And then I woke up one day and I found out that the network canceled the show, and I was out of work, and nobody, and I mean nobody, would hire me. I couldn't believe it. I couldn't get hired again. And he went for a couple of years without getting a job. And finally, he said, some guy offered me a job to play the love interest of a mermaid. And he said, I was so desperate that I took it. And it turned out to be Ron Howard who offered him. So cool. And the movie was a big hit. And he said, and when that was a hit, I decided this time I'm going to be prepared for luck. I'm going to really develop my own scripts. I'm going to choose really well. And he chose a couple of movies, Forrest Gump and Philadelphia, where he won back-to-back Oscars, and he just was ruthless about what he chose and saying no. No one went to say no and went to say yes, but he was prepared for the luck that would come. And then you saw him last week. I was really proud of him. He was the guy that was, emceeing the inauguration for Joseph Biden. So Tom Hanks has come a long way, and he's become kind of our elder statesman of Hollywood. I think he's the coolest dude out there in his own quiet way. And makes great movies, and because he was prepared for luck, and he did it. So I mean, you should be prepared for luck too. I mean, think about what you do and don't do in your career before you do it. Don't jump at the first thing. Think it over.
Wise words.
Yeah.
What advice would you give to someone that's just entering your field, journalism, or just writing in general? Start
the way you're doing it. I can't imagine a better. You're off to a head start like nobody gets. But when you go out into trying to, if you take it in school, I never took a journalism course, but then again, I had a master class from a writer at home. I was lucky enough to have a big brother. It's like living with a graduate teacher. So I learned about journalism at home. And by doing it, but I started out, when I started my career, I started in a little tiny newspaper in Brooklyn called Flatbush Life. It was just a neighborhood newspaper that covered a neighborhood called Flatbush Life. But I covered crime, I covered politics, I covered community board meetings, I covered the PTA, I covered local business councils. And so it was like the city in what you call microcosm. It was like I covered that neighborhood like it was the whole city, because it had problems with transportation, with housing, with crime, with corrupt politics, the whole shooting match. So and I learned, and they gave me a column, because after 6 months I got to express my opinion, but I had to do everything else and all the grunt work. You had to do the calendar of events, the community, and it would be there endless, and it was $100 a week. And I would be working 12 hours a day. In the beginning, do not complain about how many hours you have to work. Do not complain about the money. Get clips, get your bylines on stories that you can show to people, that you can send out, things that you're proud of. So I got a bunch of clips, and then, of course, I had a big brother. Again, I was lucky. But the people at the Village Voice would were reading some of the stories, I would send them over. I would mail them over to people. And they finally asked me to start doing freelance pieces. And then after a couple of months, they hired me full-time on staff. And then after 1 year, I won a big award there called the Meyer Berger Award from Columbia Journalism School. And then I got offered jobs all over the place, because whenever you win that award for the best New York reporting of the year, you get, and the New York Times offered me a job.
Oh, wow.
Well, I didn't want to work at the New York Times. I didn't want to go and wear a jacket and a tie and sit in the newsroom. And I didn't think they covered the city very well. And the woman couldn't believe that I turned it down. I decided to go and work for New York Magazine. They gave me a column cover in City Hall. And then I got hired to write a column out in LA. And then the same editor offered me a job in Boston. And then he gave me another job when he came back to New York at Newsday. And that led to the Daily News. So I was lucky. I got what's called a rabbi. I got a rabbi in the business. His name was Don Forst. He was from Brooklyn. And when I applied for a job at Newsday, when he was a managing editor, he said, "We can't hire you." He said, "I'm dying to hire you. You're exactly the kind of reporter I'd love to hire, but we can't, because the policy of the paper is we only hire people with daily newspaper experience, and you don't have that. Huh. You've been working for the Village Voice, and you've been working for New York Magazine. Those are weeklies. Even with your award, we won't. Our policy is stupid, but it is the policy." And then I said, "Fine." So I went to work I stayed at New York Magazine, and then he got hired as the the editor-in-chief out in Los Angeles. And first phone call he made was to me and said, "How would you like $20,000 a year and the lights of Los Angeles?" I said, "When does the next plane leave?" And I just went. And I didn't even know how to drive, and I didn't know how to drive an automobile. And when I got there, he couldn't believe it. They had to send me to driving school, because in LA you have to know how to drive. And then I just covered the city the way I covered Brooklyn, and nobody had done that before. It was like going into the inner city and talking to people that no one ever spoke to before, at crime scenes, at political rallies, at protests, and all kinds of stuff, and had a lot of fun. But it wasn't my kind of town. So when he was going to Boston, he said, "Would you like to go and do the same thing in Boston?" I said, "Let's get what plane is leaving." And I loved Boston, but it still wasn't home. I wanted to come back to New York, So I wound up.
Stories, we love them.
Yeah, and then I stayed at the Daily News for 24 years. And the last story I did for the New York Daily News, they asked me, because they were downsizing, because they were out of money, and anybody that was making a certain amount of money, they had to let go. But they said, "Could you stay for 2 more months?" I said, "Sure." And the last thing they asked me to do, well, they sent me over to Africa to do Nelson Mandela's funeral, which was a great story. I loved doing that story. Those were some of my favorite columns, that too. And then the final one was to do when the Pope visited New York.
Okay.
And Philly, and I did that. So that the very last line of my last column for the Daily News was "Amen."
Oh, I love that. That's perfect way. Thank you so much for taking your time out to be interviewed.
Thank you.
You're truly a hero.
And best luck to you, Kai. And anytime you ever you need any advice, my email. I hope you do.
So sweet.
It's Denis Hamill. With one N, Denis with one N, at gmail.com. Send me an email and I'll respond.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful evening.
Have a wonderful evening. You're truly a hero. So thank you for doing this.
I don't know about that. I'm a reporter. Talk to you later. I'm a writer. And that's what you are too. We're not heroes. We're firemen are heroes. People that run into burning buildings are heroes.
Agree.
But,
all right. Have a wonderful night.
Talk to you later.
Thank you.